Hello, brilliant minds! This is Professor Gilmore coming to you live from Woodlawn Web Academy. Today we are going to be discussing how to write and compare decimals in tenths and hundredths. This is Unit 7, Lesson 10. Now, for our lesson today, I am creating this video outside of school, so you will need to collect a whiteboard with your boxes that go up the side and along the top and down the other side. The whiteboards are over on the math shelf at the front of the classroom. Now, I don't have a whiteboard with me today, but I've shown you what your boxes should look like going up one side of your board. I have my boxes from 1 to 20, and then I've created the other side of the board going from 91 to 100. So your board numbers go all the way up, across the top, and along the other side. So collect one of these whiteboards and then follow along with me. Right now, let's write the decimal numbers that go along the sides and the top and the sides of our whiteboard. So for instance, our square at 1 would be the same as saying 1/100th in decimals. So I'm going to take my decimal and create 1/100th next to my 1 square. 1/100th should look like this, 0.01. This shows 1/100th. I'm going to do the same thing all the way up here. My second box should be 0.02 or 2/100ths. Do the same thing all the way up the top of your board and across the top, and then along the other side. Now let's think of each square as 1 penny. So 1 equals 1 penny. Or 1 penny is equal to 1/100th because there are 100 pennies in a dollar. So next to my 1/100th, I'm going to write 1 cent. 1 cent looks like 1/100th in a decimal, except it has a dollar sign. Then I'll write my 1 penny and my fraction equal to 1 penny is 1/100. Go ahead and write the same thing on your whiteboard. 1/100th equals 1 cent equals 1 penny equals 1/100th. Or 1 out of 100. So each square on this board represents 1 penny and the fraction is equal to 1/100th. 10 squares would be equal to 10 pennies and the fraction is 10 out of 100. So my 10 pennies is up here. So 10 out of 100 is the same as 1/10 or 1 dime. So in my decimal form, I'm going to put 0.1 is the same as 1/10. And I'm going to create a line here. I have my 1/10 in decimal form for my 10 pennies or 1 dime. I'm going to draw a line segment above my 10 on my whiteboard like this. So I have a line segment between 10 and 11. Then I'm going to create my money amount, which is 10 cents. So you should have a dollar sign and then 0.10. Then I'm going to write 10 pennies equals 1 dime. And in fraction form, I have 1/10 or 10/100. Go ahead and write the same thing on your board. So you have 1/10 in decimal form, 10 cents in money form, 10 pennies is equal to 1 dime is equal to 1/10 or 10 hundredths. Then I'd like you to do the same thing at each one of your 10 intervals on your whiteboard. So I'm going to create another line segment up at the top above 20, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say 20 pennies is equal to 20 hundredths or 2 tenths. So in decimal form, it's 0.2 equals 20 cents. 0.20 is equal to 20 pennies, is equal to 2 dimes, is equal to 2 tenths, or 20 hundredths. Go ahead and write the same thing on your board and go all the way up now. Go up to your 30 and do the same thing. Then your 40, then 50, then 60, then 70, then 80, all the way across the top. Then down the side, you're going to do the same thing all the way down to 100 over here. So 100 should be equal to $1 because there are 100 pennies in a dollar. And 100 should also be equal to 1 whole. Now, once you have your 20 hundredths and your 30 hundredths and your 40 hundredths, or 2 tenths and 3 tenths and 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6 tenths written all the way around your board, I'd like you to try and find a few of the following decimals and fractions. Find the fraction 5 hundredths. Well, 5 hundredths is the same as 5 pennies in a dollar. So I'm going to go back to my board and I'm going to count up in my pennies over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pennies. And I'm going to create my fraction 5 hundredths and my decimal 0.05. Do the same thing on your board for 5 hundredths. Then I'd like you to do the following fractions and find the correct decimal and then write the fraction and decimal on your whiteboard for 62 cents and 4 tenths and 98 hundredths and 3 tenths. Go ahead and do the same thing on your board for these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 examples of different fractions or money amounts, and write the fraction and the decimal next to that spot on your board. Now, another way you can compare whether something is greater than or less than in decimals is to use your decimal secret code cards. So you can compare amounts of decimals based on your whiteboard, or you can use your decimal code cards. So let's say, for instance, Karen traveled 6 tenths and her brother Jim traveled 9 tenths. Who traveled the least distance? Well, in your secret code cards, to build 6 tenths, you would use your 0.6 and 0.9 for 9 tenths. See if you can build these decimals with your secret code cards. And once you build these decimals, you can see that 6 tenths is less than 9 tenths, because 9 tenths is actually greater to 1 or closer to 1 whole than 6/10. This is like saying 6 dimes, and this is like saying 9 dimes. So I'm going to put a 6/10 is less than 9/10. Now, try this problem. Samuel traveled 7/100 and Asha traveled 7/10. 7/100 compared to 7/10. So using my secret code cards, I'm going to have to build on top of my hundredths this time and on top of my tenths. This is like saying 7 pennies, 7/100, and this is like saying 7 dimes. So knowing that information, go ahead and compare 7/100 and 7/10. Now, a question from Puzzled Penguin. Puzzled Penguin's family took 2 trips last summer. They drove 150 miles to a campground 1 month of the summer, and then 100 miles to a water park in a different month of the summer. On each trip, they traveled 6/10 of the distance before stopping for lunch. Puzzled Penguin says they traveled the same distance before lunch on both trips. Is Puzzled Penguin correct? Explain why or why not. So you have 150 miles on the first trip, and they traveled 6/10 of that distance going to before lunch. Then the second trip, they traveled 100 miles total, and they traveled 6/10 of that distance before lunch. Is the 6/10 the same amount of distance of 150 miles and 100 miles? Yes or no, and then explain why or why not. Answer that question about Puzzled Penguin in your math writing journal. Now, in your student activity book on page 259, you are going to be working on comparing distances for number 1 through 4, just like we did earlier, and telling who traveled what distance. So for number 1, Aki has traveled 3/10 of the distance, and Stephen has traveled 5/10 of the distance. You're going to write this amount in decimal form. Do the same thing for 2, 3, and 4. And then for problems 5 through 24, you're going to be using a greater than or less than symbol to compare these decimals. Now, you can use anything that you feel comfortable using to compare. You can compare using your whiteboard and find those decimals on your whiteboard and compare whether they're bigger or smaller. Or you can use your decimal code cards and build your decimals to find which one's bigger or smaller. On page 260 in your student activity book, you're going to be using your knowledge of decimals and fractions to compare and tell what decimal number represents the parts of the vacations for number 25 and 26. And then 27 and 28, you're going to use dollar amounts in decimal form. And number 29 and 30, you're going to be telling the distance of running 1/10 of a mile every day for 8 days. And number 31 through 34, they give you the decimal and you're going to write the words for that decimal. Then in number 35 and 38, they give you the words this time and you're going to write the decimals in numbers. Complete both of those pages in your student activity book.